Welcome, and thank you for attending. Questions can be asked using the questions pane in the webinar control panel. Today's presentation will be recorded. If you have any objection, you may disconnect at this time. I will now turn the presentation over to your presenter. You may begin.
Good afternoon, SHRM Long Island. I hope you all have your iPhones and got that wonderful flash flood warning. This is Henry Shapiro. The weather is just beautiful, a couple of days before Christmas, so I'm thankful for anybody that actually is taking the time to join us. Today, we are going to talk about a little bit, for anybody that was at the breakfast series with Chris yesterday, a little bit about what he went over, hopefully not as rushed, in a little bit more detail. Things to expect for 2019. I would love to be able to tell you that you can all bury your heads in the sand and not have to worry about any of this, but unfortunately, it's something that is very likely to happen. Most of what we're going to talk about is proposed right now, so I'll just put an asterisk on everything, and I've had the luxury of being able to say that to you for many things: paid family leave, a bunch of the stuff in New York City, cooperative dialogue, temporary schedule changes. Everybody gets to bury their head in the sand and say, I'm not in New York City. This is from New York State, so this will be applicable to everywhere from Buffalo, Syracuse, and Rochester, all the way out to Montauk and the Hamptons. But again, right now, it is nothing more than proposed. There's a comment period that's going to run until early January 11th. You're going to have the opportunity to put in angry letters, go to the doors of senators with torches. You shouldn't do that, but go to the doors of senators and complain and write to Albany about why this is bad for business or why it's good for business if you feel that way. As I will tell you with most things that I talk to you about, the issue here is it's going to be more work for you. It's going to be more pay to employees, more work for you, more tracking. You're going to have to possibly change the way you schedule your employees, change your management team's practices for thinking somebody called in sick. Let me go just call this girl or guy who I know is always reliable. They'll be right there. They'll come in and work the shift. That could still happen, but now there's more pay tied to it. So let's get started. What's new? So there's the new minimum wage rate increase in 2019. For those of us in Nassau and Suffolk, I think we all know that this is something that has gone up every year for the past couple of years. It's going to continue to go up. It is set by the state to go up by $1 each year until we hit the $15 cap. For now, that's where the cap is. As you know, the cost of living in New York, that could change, but that's where we're headed in 2021. Not yet, but in 2021. An increased salary threshold may be in the works for the coming year. That's something else that we all got a kind of big flavor for last year. We saw the federal government or I should say 2 years ago at this point, the federal government under President Obama had raised the salary threshold from 23 and change to 47,000 and change. Up until about a day before it was supposed to take effect, it stopped, primarily because President-elect Trump at the time was the incoming president. There was also a court decision in Texas that stopped all of this, so everybody that went ahead and gave raises to employees to keep them exempt or reclassified people as non-exempt was then stuck staring at their desks wondering, now what do we do? We've given a lot of people money. How do we go from here if now we didn't have, the reason we gave them the money doesn't exist anymore. We're still at that point. However, that could change, but probably not as drastically as it was supposed to. And the main point of today, the New York State DOL issuing these proposed regulations about scheduling and predictive scheduling and how employers bring in employees as far as shifts and call-in pay and things of that nature. So we'll do the quick one first, the minimum wage rate. Remember, a lot of people make the mistake to the extent it matters. January 1, 2019 is kind of irrelevant. It's the 31st, and that's every year. It's always December 31st, the closing year, until we tell you otherwise or your counsel tells you otherwise. So we can really just look at the second row, the Nassau, Suffolk, for most of us that are operating businesses out here. Obviously, if you're in New York City, you know this is always more of a challenge because you got to look at the size of your company and then which wage applies to you. For Nassau, Suffolk, we'll focus there. We're all going up $1. We're going from $11 to $12. Again, we'll see this again in 19. We'll see this again in 20. We'll see this again in 2021 until we go from 12 to 13 to 14 to 15. So every year, keep in mind that as New York State's minimum wage goes up, the salary threshold goes up. That number changes where you do the minimum wage times 75 times the amount of weeks in the year, 52. That number is going to keep changing each year. So keep an eye on your exempt level professionals that are hovering around assuming they're properly classified based on their duties, that are hovering around the $40,000, $50,000 mark. These are people that should be flagged, maybe every October or November. Just get ready for what comes at the end of December when the wage changes. So the salary threshold rule, August 2017 is what I was talking about with the Texas. We had a judge prevent the DOL rule from going into effect. Now, recently, this is becoming a point of the Trump administration as well, because let's be realistic, $23,660 is a very low figure. It was a little aggressive, considered by some, to basically double it, which is what President Obama's administration had done. But the $23,660 is still the federal number for now. New York State has its own number, but $23,660 is the federal number. It is likely we will see that go up in the next possible year or two. I will tell you this, in the event that a Democrat takes office in 2020 or 2022, when after inauguration, this will likely become a focal point. This is something that will likely be picked up by President Obama. I said 2022, my years are off. January of 2021. So we're all looking for the 2020 election. We will see. 4 more years of President Trump, it will likely go up minimally, but it will go up most likely. If we get a Democrat, likely that this goes up a lot higher, maybe closer to the President Obama recommendation of 47.6. Now we get to the predictive scheduling, and I will keep you all wide awake with these next 12 minutes of what is to come down the pike in 2019 for probably everybody on this webinar. So these proposed regulations on predictive scheduling, they are going to require all employers covered under the New York State minimum wage order, the miscellaneous minimum wage order, which is almost everybody. You can take out the hospitality, you can take out the hotels, restaurants that are covered under there. But for those of you who are not within those industries, everything I'm about to say would apply to you should these regulations get adopted. So it's the big term you're going to take away from this is call-in pay. That's really what we're talking about. So the key word being pay. It's going to go from anywhere from either 2 or 4 hours of call-in pay. There are situations where it could be something other than, it could be 3, depending on what an employee's shift that you were calling them in for would be. But 2 to 4 are really kind of your golden area of hours. So for employer, the call-in pay requirements will come into play if an employer does not provide a non-exempt employee 14 days advance notice of their work shift. If an employer cancels the employee's shift without at least 14 days advance notice. If the employer requires employees to work on call, which we'll get into in a second, or if the employer requires a non-exempt employee to report to work, but then send home, it's not busy, or crowds died down, it's not what we thought it was going to be, or the weather cleared up, so that blizzard that was coming is not going to happen. As a former grocery store employee, you are talking with somebody who knows the trials and tribulations of dealing with weather and blizzards, especially in Nassau County. And we already said the employers covered the hotel and restaurant industry. This is not something that will really concern you right now, unless these proposed regulations change to cover you. So show-up pay. This is one of the first things that the new regulations set forth, and again, proposed regulations. If an employee reports to work and is sent home, the employer must pay the non-exempt employee at least 4 hours at the minimum wage. So for next year, assuming this gets adopted next year, we're talking about the new minimum wage. We are talking about the $12 an hour minimum wage, not the 11 that we're currently under. Unless the employee is scheduled to work less than 4 hours, and this is where I was alluding that it's usually going to be 2 or 4, but there could be scenarios where it's something else. Unless the employee is scheduled to work less than 4 hours, in which case the employer must pay the employee for the number of hours the employee is scheduled to work. So what that means is, if you needed me to come in and work for you from 1 to 4, you don't have to pay me 4 hours. You only needed me from 1 to 4. You're only asking me to work 1 to 4. You got to pay me those 3 at the minimum wage, but you don't have to pay me the 1. You don't have to pay me 4. The proposed regulation eliminates the exception. I want everybody to pay attention to this. The proposed regulation eliminates the exception under the current law, which states if the employee's regular rate is sufficiently above the minimum wage so that the amount earned by the employee in excess of the minimum wage is more than the show-up pay requirement. What does that mean? That means for all of you who have, I don't want to say highly compensated employees, but people making, significantly above the $11 minimum wage, $20 an hour, $21 an hour, something like that. We became accustomed to, there's essentially a set-off. We don't need to worry about paying them the extra. We pay them enough over the minimum wage that it covers it. That's going to be gone in this. If this goes through as proposed. Again, that could change. It could come back. We don't know yet. This is where employer comments maybe could make a difference. Thus, covered employees, regardless of their wage rate, will be entitled to show-up pay if they report to work and are sent home. So you're getting that if your shift is more than 4 hours, you're getting that 4 hours of call-in pay, of show-up pay is what they're calling it here. You're getting that 4 hours of show-up pay, even if you come in and you say, oh, we only need you for 15 minutes. You still get it. All right, different shifts. An unscheduled shift. So under the proposed regulations, if employees are required to work a shift that has not been scheduled at least 14 days in advance of the shift, the employee will be entitled to an additional 2 hours of call-in pay at the minimum wage. So that's one that can really take you for a spin. It could throw you in the sense that what if right now you say, Henry, our scheduling practices, we do the schedule a week in advance. This is going to be something you have to account for. You'll have the option of either kicking your scheduling back even further and trying to plan 2 weeks in advance with the 14 days notice, or you're going to have to set up your payroll, set up your HR function to become accustomed to having to pay out 2 hours of call-in pay at the minimum wage. And again, for those of you who are larger employers, maybe you're saying 2 hours of pay at the minimum wage is what next year going to be $24. Okay, I'll swallow it. I'm not changing my entire scheduling practice. That's fine. That's your decision. Just understand this could happen on a massive level to the point that your exposure becomes much larger than one employee at $24. So it's just something to think about. As the benefit of doing this, of looking into this right now, is December 21st. You all will, I assume many of you are off on Christmas Day. I think that's a great time for you to all dig into these regulations and learn more. What better than watching some Christmas shows while talking about predictive scheduling? It sounds like the perfect holiday. Or you could just spend these next couple of weeks, months, getting ready and thinking, okay, what would make sense in our business? Can we kick our scheduling to 14 days out? It's something to at least evaluate while this is all still proposed, and you don't have to fall in line just yet. Canceled shift. Employees whose shifts are canceled without at least 14 days notice, so this kind of goes hand in hand with the unscheduled. Employees whose shifts are canceled without at least 14 days notice must be paid 2 hours of call-in pay at the minimum wage. Those whose shifts are canceled with less than 72 hours notice must be paid 4 hours of call-in pay. So as you can see, the penalty worsens with the lesser amount of notice that you provide. So what's this saying? If you don't give enough notice of canceling a shift, you decide the day before that business has been slow, you just locked yourself, and you say, I want to cancel 2 people's shifts tomorrow, you just locked yourself into paying 8 hours, 4 to each employee, 8 hours of call-in pay because you only gave a day's notice. Again, proposed, but it can become a cost, and I will tell you, I think all of you on this call will know that most times in New York State that something's proposed, it usually ends up happening. Minimum wage, sexual harassment, paid family leave, we typically end up seeing it, so get ready. On-call shifts. Employees who are required to be on call, which is just available to report to work, and we can spend hours on the difference between engaged to be waiting and waiting to be engaged, but the question here is, if you are, the issue here is if you are required to be on call such that your employee, as the employer, you're saying, I need you to be able to report at a moment's notice, you must be paid 4 hours of call-in pay. Again, this is just an additional payment for somebody who may, you may call them in, you may not. Another 4 hours, it is just another cost that you need to budget for if this comes into effect. Call for a schedule. An employee who is required to be in contact with the employer within 72 hours before the start of the shift to confirm whether to report to work also must be paid 4 hours of call-in pay at the minimum wage. So it doesn't, this is not a one time where this could come up and that's it. This is something that you are going to see in multiple facets of your business, where shift cancellation, somebody calls in sick and you need to fill the shift, but you don't give them, quote unquote, enough notice under the law. Just be prepared. You're going to have to start paying more. You're going to have to pay more than you usually would pay, which is just the wages for the employee for the hours worked. As with every law, there's exceptions. I think the first one is the most classic. When there's a collective bargaining agreement, we all see that if you're bargaining with your union and there are provisions that regard call-in pay, we can get into significant detail as to whether you have to use those actual words. That's not clear. But if the call-in pay concept is there, I'm comfortable that we can, you can defend against a union trying to say that this is not sufficient. Employees who earn more than 40 times the minimum wage during the week are excluded from most of the requirements, but not the requirement for show-up pay. So we went over the show-up pay before. It's the one literally where you show up and you're sent home because the need for the employee is not there. That does not, at least as the regulations is currently written, an exempt employee, as we typically think of them, an exempt employee, more than 40 times the minimum wage. Usually when you're getting that high, we're thinking about exempt employees, not always, but usually. When you get that high, the exempt person is not excluded anymore. Again, something that everybody's become used to that might be a change if these go into effect. Employees whose duties are directly dependent on weather conditions whose duties are necessary to protect the health or safety of the public or any person, or whose assignment are subject to work orders or work cancellations. So we don't know a ton about this yet because we don't really have interpretive guidance. The weather conditions is pretty clear. You can think of people who, if anybody's at the breakfast series yesterday, Chris used the example of a car wash. You're not going to report if you're in a hurricane if you work at a car wash. So the employer has some reprieve from these call-in pay requirements. If you cancel everybody's shift because, hey, yesterday was 85 and sunny, today hurricane. Employees who volunteer for an unscheduled shift are excluded from the unscheduled shift requirement, and the regulation lays out the framework for a process to document voluntariness in this regard. So you do have somewhat of a reprieve here as well if somebody volunteers, if you do it as the regulations require. There's a safe harbor provision, and I don't want to take too much more of your time. There's a safe harbor provision which allows an employer to assign an employee to cover a shift without the call-in pay requirement for an unscheduled shift if the employer does what's on this slide. So you got to provide a good faith estimate of the scheduled hours. That you'll document before you do it to the employees upon hiring, and if the request to cover the new or previously scheduled shift is made by the employee whose shift would be covered, so basically the one who's looking to get out of his or her shift is going to make the request, or if the employer does it in writing to a group of employees requesting a volunteer. So you got to figure out if you do it all to all of your aides or to all of your administrative assistants, whatever the group is, and you give a reasonable deadline for responses. We all got a little familiar with this predictive scheduling because we saw it in New York City. As always with most things, New York City is ahead of the curve, or in some cases setting the curve. New York City started with this in certain industries, mostly seen in retail, where certain retail employers started requiring employees to work on call, while the proposed regulations merely impose a penalty for such. So there's differences between the two. This is not one where it's going to be a one-for-one exact copy of New York City, at least not yet. Again, proposed. There could be changes from New York City employers who say we don't want to have to comply with two different sets of predictive scheduling regulations. Make this easier on us. So we'll end here with our next steps. We have 30 days for a comment period. There is no deadline for the DOL to issue these final regulations. So you could see it in February, you could see it in June, you could see it in November. It's unclear. Covered employers should begin a thorough review of their policies. So everything we already went over. Just now is the time to start anticipating your budgets for 2019, what you may now be required to do as far as call-in pay, show-up pay, things of that nature, and get the word out. If this is something that you think is going to cause a detriment to your business, let Albany know. Speak with counsel. You could talk about these things to try to figure out how you can kind of mitigate the adverse impact this is going to have on your industry if that's the case. We also want to take a look at the exceptions, see which employees do fit, don't fit. But with that, we will end the Lunch and Learn series for 2018. I wish everybody a very happy holiday season if you observe, and a happy new year, and we look forward to speaking with you in January. Take care.